Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Drue Crime. I'm your host, Drue V, and for my 20th episode, I'm going to be covering the very baffling case of a missing person, Kelley Brannon. Now, this is an unsolved case that includes a very modicum amount of concrete evidence that will honestly leave you pondering what may have happened to this very free-spirited woman. On July 9, 2020, Kelley and her at-the-time boyfriend Eddie Emerson, accompanied with his dog and a cage full of chickens, were all driving on their way from Micanopy, Florida to Detroit, Michigan to get a new start on life, when suddenly one of their vehicles decided to break down just hours into their trip. And after being towed the following day, this is how they would end up in the small town of Live Oak, Florida. After arriving in Live Oak, they then learned that their vehicle that broke down would now take a few days before it could be fixed. So the couple and all of their animals would end up camping out in the hot Florida summer for the next couple days, before eventually deciding to rent a cheap motel on July 14th at the dilapidated Sunshine Inn, which is located in what many people considered to be a sketchy part of town. As this story unfolds, we find out that there's a disagreement between Kelley and Eddie about where they would now store their chickens that they brought along on their trip, being that Eddie did not want them in the room, and in return, this sparks a huge argument between the two. As the night carries on and insults are exchanged between the two, they both eventually separate, leaving Eddie up in the motel room by himself, and Kelley locked out of the room and now drinking and mingling with others, who were also staying and hanging around at the Sunshine Inn. After hours of arguing mainly through text messages, Eddie finally decides to turn his phone off and go to sleep, basically leaving Kelley outside to fend for herself. Then late into the night around 1 a.m., Kelley calls Eddie's now turned off phone and leaves an unsettling voicemail for him that ends with her saying, "I'm getting into a car right now. All right, bye." But unfortunately, this would be the last words that Eddie or any one of her friends and family members would ever hear from Kelley Brannon, and this is also where this case takes a very puzzling turn. The rest of this story takes you on a wild ride filled with many holes and numerous theories that have been thought up about this case. Did Kelley end up taking a ride from someone that night, and that's how she possibly met her own demise? Or did Kelley just decide to leave all of her personal belongings behind at the Sunshine Inn and just go start a new life? Whatever the reason or reasons were for her leaving that night, in the end it really only leaves one to speculate on what may have happened to Kelley Brannon. So please join me on the rest of this episode as I get into who Kelley Brannon was. Then I'll tell Kelley's story from the details that I have found in my research on this case. And then I'll visit a few popular theories that many have had over the past 5 years about Kelley's disappearance. And then to close out the episode, I'll give any last final thoughts that I have about Kelley's still open case. To this day, no one seems to know what may have happened to Kelley Brannon that night she disappeared from the Sunshine Inn in Live Oak, Florida. But other people, including her boyfriend, were there, and somebody knows. This is Drue Crime, Episode 20, Kelley Brannon. Now, before I really get started on Kelley's story, I just wanted to let everyone know where I found my information for this episode and where you're able to find it too. And I will also let you know where you are able to find all of my Drue Crime episodes as well. So to start, I would check out the show Never Seen Again, which streams on Paramount Plus. And Kelley's 2-part episodes that were done back in 2022 are on Season 1, Episodes 3 and 4. Now, fair warning when it comes to this particular show, because though these episodes do provide a lot of great information about Kelley's case, they also do provide some information that may not be completely accurate as well. I also noticed that the show itself doesn't quite go into great detail about a lot of important parts of this case, but that's also a good reason why I never stick to one source while researching for a case. Yet there are other great sources out there for this case, to which I will list here next. The source that I found the most helpful that provides amazing detail about this case was from the Two Sleuths podcast that is hosted by a news anchor and investigative journalist, Kaplan, and former special agent and hostage negotiator, M. Now, I wasn't able to listen to the two-part episode these two did on Kelley Brannon's case that was done back in 2023, but I was able to find the transcripts for these episodes, and you can read these transcripts on Listen Notes, to which I will have links for these transcripts in the episode description box. I do have to say here that the amount of detail that is provided in these episodes is absolutely wonderful, and I encourage anyone who wants to learn more about Kelley's case to definitely check them out and give them a read. Now, the last source I'll suggest for more great information on Kelley's case is the Missing Kelley Brannon Facebook group. I applaud the authors of this group for taking the time and answering many lingering questions that others, including myself, have had about Kelley's case. But in order to really locate a lot of the information in this group, I suggest clicking on the comments to each of the different posts to really obtain a lot of the information that's available. From what I was able to gather, different friends of Kelley run different social media accounts for her, and everyone is located in several states that had met Kelley in various different ways, though mostly through art and music. All of the sources I just listed for this episode will be listed in the episode description box, and again, I encourage anyone interested in Kelley's case to check them all out. Now, all of my Drue Crime episodes can be found on all major platforms such as Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, and many more. I also do have a Drue Crime YouTube channel where I post PowerPoint videos to go along with the episodes I publish, and I also encourage people to comment on the episodes that I publish as well. If you're someone who has any information about a case that I cover or just wants to discuss a case further, please feel free to message me on Instagram, Facebook, or you can even email me at truecrimepodcast@gmail.com. Also, still to this day, no one has ever been charged with any crimes relating to Kelley Brannon's disappearance, and anyone I do speak about during the course of this episode is innocent of any wrongdoing unless proven otherwise later on. Now, as always, with all of that out of the way, let's get right into who Kelley Brannon was. Kelley Brannon was born on May 2nd, 1984, and grew up in the small town of Charleston, New Hampshire. When Kelley went missing, she was 36 years old, had brown eyes, black hair with gray streaks, and a tattoo on her right hand with the circle A on it. Kelley was a free-spirited nomad who loved traveling and meeting new people, and she did this for about a year after graduating high school, and then after that she went back to school and received her bachelor's degree in fine arts at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. After that, she then pursued and received a master's degree in creative writing from Goddard College that's located in Vermont. Kelley was a human and animal rights activist. She was anti-fascism and anti-capitalism. She was an artist and a filmmaker where she wrote and directed a short film called Empty Spaces. She was also a solo punk musician who played a rare left-handed Stratocaster guitar, and the name of her band was the Baby Killers, where she mainly sang songs about social issues. And Kelley also happened to be a very talented writer as well. When it comes to her family, Kelley had an older brother. Sadly, her father had passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack when she was 5 years old, which seemed to have a traumatic impact on her and the rest of her family. Kelley also had a mother, Christine Brannon, to whom the two of them were very close, but unfortunately, Christine would later pass away in 2023, just a few years after Kelley went missing. People who knew Kelley have said she was fun, outgoing, but also clashed with many people and had a punk-type attitude. One of her friends has said Kelley was like a stick of dynamite, funny and crazy in the best way. In 2019, while traveling on tour, she arrived at a bar in Gainesville, Florida, where she would then end up meeting a man named Eddie Emerson, who was 6 years younger than Kelley. And the two of them hit it off right away before they would eventually start dating and touring together. And then they decided to settle down together on a farm in a town called McNopie, Florida, which is just south of Gainesville. and you'll be hearing a lot more about Eddie as I get into Kelley's story. So all in all, it seemed that Kelley was very passionate about the things that she was involved in and was very likable to many people, while also being a great friend to those who knew her. But at the same time, she also seemed to be the type of person who didn't take people's shit and would tell you how it is. Now, to start Kelley's story, I just wanted to point out here again that Eddie Emerson was the boyfriend of Kelley when she went missing, and the two of them had met on June 19, 2019 in Gainesville, Florida, when Kelley was on her first music tour by herself. The two then started dating, and after a year of many ups and downs in their relationship, to which I will mention again here later, they then decided on July 8, 2020 to pack up all of their things, including 8 chickens and Eddie's dog Gordon, and their plan was to now go buy a $2,000 house in Detroit, Michigan, where Kelley had previously lived years before in 2015. So the following day on the 9th, they left the farm that they had been living at and took 2 vehicles during this trip. Kelley drove her Toyota Camry while Eddie drove his Toyota pickup. Well, Eddie's truck broke down just a couple hours into their trip on Interstate 75, and then after sleeping in their vehicles for the night, the following day on the 10th, his truck was then towed into Live Oak, Florida to Reese's Auto, where both Kelley and Eddie were unfamiliar of this area and did not know anyone in this town. According to Wikipedia, Live Oak is a city and the county seat of Suwannee County, Florida. The city is midway between Tallahassee and Jacksonville, and as of 2020, the population recorded by the U.S. Census Bureau was 6,735 people. U.S. Highway 90, U.S. Highway 129, and Interstate 10 are major highways running through Live Oak, which can increase its population during the day, so lots of vehicles are coming and going from that area, which could play into one of the theories that I will share later on relating to Kelley's disappearance. Now, Reese's Auto is where Eddie's truck was supposed to get fixed, but it turns out Reese's would end up not having the part needed for his truck, so both Kelley and Eddie would have to wait and stay in Live Oak until the part for Eddie's truck was obtained, and then also allow some time for the truck to be fixed before they were able to continue on their journey to Detroit. So after getting the bad news about Eddie's truck, Kelley and Eddie decided they needed to find a place to store these 8 chickens while they wait for his truck to be fixed, being that they knew it probably wouldn't be allowed to store these chickens inside a hotel room. So they started going into local businesses in the Live Oak area to ask people if anyone knew of a place where they could keep their chickens. And this is when they stumbled into a sandwich shop, and there they were able to find a guy named Alfredo that was willing to help them store their chickens on his property. So Kelley and Eddie decided to follow Alfredo to his property, which is about a 20-minute drive from where they were, and there they dropped off their chickens. Next, the two of them decide to get a motel in a neighboring city called Lake City, and then they stay the night there. So the following morning, they then went out and bought a tent, and without telling Alfredo, they then went back to his property where the chickens were being kept and camped there for the night. Now, the following day after that, Kelley and Eddie got up and went to a few different towns to try and find a used car part that the auto shop needed to fix Eddie's truck. And I believe they did this to try and save money versus having to have the auto shop order a new part themselves, which we all know would have been much more expensive. I do have to point out here that Kelley was someone who was very conservative with how she spent her money, and this could be contributed as to why they were trying to get to Detroit to buy a house for $2,000, also why they were out searching for a used cheaper car part, and why they also did a lot of free camping as well. So after finding the car part they needed, they then headed back to the auto shop and dropped it off there. But since the auto shop was closed for the day, they then decided to head back to Alfredo's property to camp for another night, and again, they did not inform Alfredo that they were doing so. So the next morning, which is now July 14th, Alfredo's wife discovers Kelley and Eddie camping on their property, and she was not happy about it at all. Now, Alfredo did allow them to store the chickens there, but no one ever told them that they were allowed to camp there as well. So Kelley and Eddie packed up their things, including their chickens, and headed back to the auto shop, but they then learned Eddie's car was not yet ready, So instead of camping another night out in the Florida heat, they decided to rent a cheap room at the sketchy 2-story Sunshine Inn in room 70, located in downtown Live Oak, and this is where the story takes a very mysterious turn. So after the two got settled into their hotel room around 5:30 p.m., this is when a huge argument occurs about what they plan to do next with the chickens. According to Eddie, Kelley wanted to bring the chickens upstairs into the room for the night, but Eddie did not. Eddie claimed that the chickens were starting to smell, and he also feared that hotel management could learn of this and kick them out. According to the Never Seen Again episode, the chickens were eventually brought up into the room, and Eddie was, in his words, pissed off about it and started yelling at Kelley. And I think at some point one of them had brought the chickens back downstairs to the parking lot. Well, this big argument would last for hours, and at some point the two of them had separated, and Eddie was up in the room while Kelley had driven off somewhere and ended up getting some pizza and wine before coming back, and then they argued some more before Kelley would go back outside the room and start mingling with others who were staying and hanging around the motel. So a lot of the arguing was being done through text messages, and according to screenshots from Eddie's phone, the arguing went from 6:30 p.m. that night on the 14th to 12:48 a.m. early the next morning on the 15th. I was able to gather in my research that there were a numerous amount of texts that were sent between the two that night, some even being deleted later on. So for this episode, I'm just going to use the examples that were used in the two Sleuths podcast, because again, there are many of them that did occur during that time frame, and I was really only able to screenshot some of the other texts I found, and I'll include those on my YouTube video for this episode. Now, a few examples of some of the texts that were being sent between the two were, "I am not going to be a white trash Florida girl letting you throw me around in the parking lot of a cheap motel. Thanks for ignoring me and locking me out, con man." And in other texts, she's calling Eddie an abuser. In some of the other texts that were sent from Kelley, she also says, "Enjoy the car, got my guitar and a new bag of clothes. Guess you'd figured you'd get the car eventually. Congrats, you won." And then Eddie responds to this particular text by saying, "Why don't you come and sleep?" And Kelley responds with, "No, I'd rather starve to death or jump off a bridge or be eaten by vultures than to share a room with someone like you." And Eddie just responds to that text with the single letter K, meaning okay. And then in some of Kelley's last texts, she makes a threat that she's leaving, she's pressing charges, and that she's going to report the car being stolen, to which she did none of these things except for eventually leave later on. But it still to this day remains unknown how she left the hotel property that night, and this I will be talking more about here soon. Now, real quick, I just wanted to bring some context to some of these texts that were sent to Eddie from Kelley. In a few of these texts, she says, "I'm not going to be a white trash Florida girl letting you throw me around in the parking lot of a cheap motel," and also that he was an abuser. Now, according to sources, Eddie and Kelley have had numerous incidents involving domestic violence, particularly on one night back in December of 2019 where Eddie had hit Kelley in the face, which ended up giving her a black eye. And Eddie, of course, was arrested for this incident and spent a week in jail. Also, between April and May in 2020, police were called to their residence in Micanopy 12 different times for separate domestic incidents, which is actually a huge reason why they left the farm in Florida to move to Detroit to begin with, because the owner of that property was tired of finding out that the cops were being called repeatedly over there for these incidents, and he now wanted them off his property. From what I understand, both Kelley and Eddie were not fun people to be around sometimes when they were drinking, and this could also explain why this argument at the hotel got so out of control, because Eddie claims that Kelley had already been drinking that day. Now, one of the other texts I wanted to bring context to was the text from Kelley that said, "Thanks for ignoring me and locking me out, con man." Well, during the course of this fight around 10:30 p.m. that night, another man that I'll just call JR for now, he was staying in the room right next to Eddie and Kelley's room in room 69. And JR reportedly knocked on Eddie's door and basically said, "Hey man, you need to come down to get your girl. She's upset. It's not a good situation." And I'll be talking more about JR towards the end of the episode when I get into the theories about this case. So at this point, Kelley was hysterically crying outside on the hotel stairs, and I believe this is because Eddie had called her stupid and also called her the C word at some point in their argument. And if you know what I mean by the C word, it's just a word you don't ever say to a woman, especially to someone whom you love. So while Kelley was crying on these steps, Eddie said he then went outside, they argued some more, and then he yanked Kelley's car keys and hotel keys from her waist area, and then he went back into the room and locked the door. And according to Eddie later on, this was actually the last time he said he ever saw Kelley ever again. Now, from what I understand, Eddie also had sent another text to Kelley that night before deciding to turn off his phone and then going to bed, but I'm not quite sure what that text entailed. So after Eddie went back into the room, Kelley called his phone at 12:59 a.m., which then went to voicemail. So Kelley left him a voicemail, and then after this voicemail was left, Kelley literally vanished. And as far as anyone knows, she was never to be seen or heard from ever again.
Oh, great, you're sleeping. I'm so glad I got that message from you before telling me how you're sorry and you love me and how you want me so much and all that bullshit just to get my car. Well, anyways, I've rented my own room at the Sunshine Inn and I've reported my car stolen and told them who stole it. So expect cops knocks at your door. And I will be right next door at my own motel room because I'm not allowed to stay with you because what is you paying? Oh, you get the benefit because you only look out for you. It's your money. It's just for you. But my money's for both of us, essentially, which is bullshit. And I should obviously definitely do the Detroit thing on my own or go to Iceland. Like, you are not a partner. You're not a partner. You turn on me a split second, you turn me out of nowhere, and I deserve way better. I did nothing to be called a fucking stupid idiot, and I did nothing to be called a cunt. So, I'm sick of your abuse. So go find. I'm gonna get in a car right now. All right, bye.
Now, real quick before I move on here, there was surveillance footage outside the Sunshine Inn that was acquired later on, and it did capture Kelley walking through the parking lot. But this surveillance was not from the time right before she disappeared, but the footage itself was from about 4 hours before she disappeared, where she was seen on surveillance at 8:42 p.m. and then again at 8:50 p.m. I think there's a lot of people out there, including myself, that were confused by this as it was shown on the Never Seen Again episode. But just to reiterate, it was not from the time she disappeared, but from hours earlier. According to Captain Roundtree of the Live Oak Police Department that headed this case, any surveillance footage they acquired later on never actually showed Kelley leaving that parking lot on foot at all, or even in a car for that matter. Now, according to the Two Sleuths podcast, it is important to note that only part of the motel parking lot is covered by this motel surveillance camera. Now, this camera is mounted near the front desk overhang, and it looks over the west side of the parking lot toward the room that Kelley and Eddie were staying in, although the room is not visible in the shot, and I will have a diagram on the YouTube video that shows this. There's also a few more rooms on the other side of the motel, including the area where the motel owners were living, as well as a fence where you can kind of see into the motel property next door, which is the Live Oak Motel. But none of these particular areas are covered by any cameras. And the Sunshine Inn did have other cameras on the property, but none of them were operating that night. Also, around 2 a.m., which was about an hour after Kelley left the voicemail, allegedly her Gmail synced from her phone somewhere in downtown Live Oak, which was about 1.5 miles from the Sunshine Inn, and from what I have heard, this was the last known movement of Kelley after she somehow left the motel property. But according to sources that covered this case, this piece of information has never actually been confirmed by law enforcement and seems questionable at best. So now I'm going to fast forward a few hours to around 8 a.m. on July 15th when Eddie said he woke up in the motel room and noticed Kelley was not in bed with him. Which right off the bat is kind of strange that he said that, being that he locked Kelley out of the room from the night before. He then said he went out to the motel parking lot to see if Kelley was sleeping in her car, to which she was not there. So according to Eddie's phone records, he tried to call Kelley around 8:03 a.m. and then again at 8:21 a.m., but received no answers. He also sent Kelley a text at 8:54 a.m. that asked, "What are you doing?" But again, Eddie received no response back from Kelley. Eddie then said he walked around the motel property asking if anyone had seen Kelley, because during their argument from the night before, Kelley had been conversing with other people outside the hotel, but no one said they saw her later on in the night, other than a few sightings that have never been confirmed. Eddie then said he packed up their things, which was captured by the motel surveillance, and then he checked out of the hotel, and then he started driving around Live Oak searching for Kelley. I wanted to point out here that surveillance also captured Eddie checking out of the motel, and the surveillance showed Eddie's dog sitting in the front seat of the car, but there was no sign of Kelley. Now, while searching for Kelley, Eddie then noticed that her purse had been left behind and was still in the car. And I'm almost certain that her purse had her ID and credit cards inside of it, because it's been reported that she left those things behind as well. Also, it's been said that the only thing that ended up missing of Kelley's later on was her rare left-handed Stratocaster guitar with the branding shaved off, which is still out there somewhere today. And many people believe if this guitar is ever found, it could help link to who may have stolen it, which could help unlock some clues in this mystery. So after searching for Kelley around Live Oak and coming up empty-handed, Eddie then drives to the Live Oak police station and reports Kelley missing. Next, the police tell Eddie that since Kelley was an adult, she was free to leave any situation she didn't want to be in, but at some point, Captain Roundtree tells Eddie he would go ahead and put out a bolo on her, which basically alerts other officers in the region to keep a lookout for her and for them to be able to make contact with Kelley if they end up seeing her. So after leaving the police station, at some point in the afternoon, Eddie then makes a call to a local hospital, but Kelley is not there either. Then it's been said that he went back to the farm in Micanopy, where they had just been living, so he could look for Kelley there, because Kelley had made claims via text messages during their argument that she was going to return to the farm and drop some of Eddie's things off there. Eddie says he found no sign of Kelley returning there, and so he eventually made his way back to Live Oak. Later that same evening, he checked back into the Sunshine Inn once again, and this time he was given a different room. Now, at some point later on in the same evening, Eddie also called one of Kelley's friends to tell them she had been missing from the night before. Others of Kelley's friends were also notified of her missing, and they called and texted Kelley repeatedly in the coming days, but never got a response from her. From what I have gathered, some of Kelley's friends who lived in Gainesville have said they wonder why Eddie didn't call them immediately after he realized Kelley was missing, since some of them lived on the way to the farm that was just outside Gainesville, and the fact that Kelley has stayed with some of these friends before when things weren't going well between Eddie and her. Kelley's mother was also notified of her missing, and even though she and Kelley were very close, she too had not heard anything from Kelley either. So after calling Kelley's friends, Eddie would end up staying in Live Oak for a couple more days. According to the Two Sleuths podcast, during these couple days, Eddie was pretty much relentless in trying to find Kelley, and had even started calling the Live Oak Police Department 6 times an hour looking for some kind of update. He had also created a Facebook page dedicated to her being missing, while coordinating with other people to help look for her. And at some point, he even used Kelley's credit card to make some missing flyers to put up around Live Oak. So on July 17th, it had now been a couple days since Kelley went missing, and law enforcement catches wind that Eddie is planning to leave Live Oak and drive north back home to one of his parents' houses in Massachusetts, with Kelley's car, I might add. So Captain Roundtree sends another officer over to the Sunshine Inn to get Eddie, and they brought him in to conduct an interview which lasted around 3 to 4 hours. So after the interview, police then searched both Kelley's vehicle and Eddie's vehicle, and they also obtained a search warrant for both of their phones as well. After these things occurred, Eddie was then allowed to get his personal belongings from his truck that was still at the shop. And then he swapped out his stuff for Kelley's stuff and left hers behind in the truck. And I do have to say that according to the Kelley Brannon Missing Facebook group, a lot of Kelley's things, including her artwork, would end up getting ruined as it sat in that truck, and then they were eventually disposed of. Law enforcement also allowed Eddie to leave for Massachusetts with Kelley's laptop and her purse, but Eddie was supposed to give these items to her mother in New Hampshire, to which he eventually did, but he did not do this until about a week or so after he had arrived back to his parents' house in Massachusetts. There are a lot of people online that question why Eddie was allowed to take Kelley's belongings, including her car, back to Massachusetts, but from what I understand, everything was eventually returned to her mother, and her car was eventually sold as well. I just wanted to point out here that the chickens were also left behind, and from what I understand, they were left on the front lawn of the motel. And even months after Kelley disappeared, it's been said that these chickens were still roaming the property of the Sunshine Inn. Now, in the coming weeks, there had still been no sign of Kelley anywhere, and according to the Two Sleuths podcast, detectives from the Live Oak Police Department and many other agencies worked to chase down leads, including the dismaying task of going through hundreds to thousands of emails and tips that this case had generated, because at this point in time, the case had gained some national attention. Police conducted a forensic search in 2 of the rooms at the Sunshine Inn, which was the room that Eddie and Kelley were staying in, and the room next door that JR was staying in. But I do believe both of these rooms were never searched until a month after Kelley had disappeared. And as far as I know, nothing was found to help further their investigation. Law enforcement also interviewed Eddie numerous times, totaling to around 13 hours worth of interviews. And investigative journalist and Two Sleuths podcast host Katie Kaplan also interviewed Eddie numerous times during the course of her own investigation as well. Police used volunteers and drones to search the area where Kelley disappeared from. That also included over a dozen ground searches as well, but they still didn't find anything. Captain Roundtree also said that they did a search of the farm down in Micanopy, and that was done with volunteers who had cadaver dogs, but to no avail, they did not find anything there either. There were also around 20 people questioned that were working or hanging around the Sunshine Inn on the day that Kelley disappeared, and some of these people did say they saw Kelley later on that night, but as I mentioned earlier, none of these eyewitness accounts did much to help investigators solve this mystery. And it's important to know here that there are a total of 6 persons of interest in this case, to whom were all staying at the Sunshine Inn that night Kelley had disappeared, and this includes Eddie as well. Also, later on, Kelley's friends were able to raise some money online, so they were able to hire some private investigators to help with this case. But I wasn't able to find a whole lot of helpful information on these investigators, so for now I just kind of have to leave it at that. So then after years went by and really no new information came out about Kelley's disappearance, this is basically where the case would start to turn cold. And even though there have been numerous alleged sightings of Kelley over the years, ranging from places such as Georgia all the way to Mexico, unfortunately none of these sightings have ever been considered credible, and Kelley Brannon still remains somewhere out there today. So next I'm going to get into some already speculated theories that surround Kelley's case, which will lead me into talking a little bit more about Eddie, and then I'll wrap up the episode and give any of my final thoughts or opinions about Kelley Brannon's still open case. Again, anyone I do speak about in these theories is innocent of any wrongdoing when it comes to the disappearance of Kelley Brannon, unless proven otherwise. Now, one of the main theories in this case is that after Kelley left that final voicemail on Eddie's phone, she then just left on her own accord. A lot of people do find this to be plausible given the fact that Kelley has been considered by many to be nomadic and free-spirited. And a lot of times, someone who is this way has the tendency to move from place to place and enjoys the freedoms of being able to do so. Now, there are a few issues here that do make this theory a lot less plausible in my opinion, and to list a few, I think if Kelley were able to get up and leave on her own accord, it doesn't make any sense that she would leave all of her personal belongings behind, more notably her car, purse, wallet, credit cards, and identification. As I said earlier in this episode, Kelley was someone who was very conservative with their money, so it just doesn't make much sense that she would just leave all of her finances behind, and from what I have read, when she went missing, she had approximately $10,000 in her bank account, and as far as I know, none of it has ever been touched. I also mentioned earlier in this episode that she had a very strong relationship with her mother, as well as a lot of her friends. So this too just doesn't make a whole lot of sense as to why she would go the last 5 years without having zero contact with any of them. And her friends have even said that Kelley would never have done something like this to her mother. So I guess it's not impossible that Kelley could have left on her own to maybe even go start a new life, but given the reasons I just listed above, I don't find this theory to be very plausible in this case. Another main theory in this case that is talked about a lot is that Kelley actually did get into someone else's car and left the Sunshine Inn property after leaving the voicemail on Eddie's phone, and whoever's car that she got into, they ended up doing something very bad to Kelley, and that's why she disappeared. I personally feel that this theory is actually very plausible in this case, given the fact that the Sunshine Inn was in a sketchy part of Live Oak, and the amount of traffic that does go through the area due to the nearby interstate and highways. But the only problem is we don't actually know if Kelley did in fact get into someone else's car that night, and unfortunately there's no surveillance from the Sunshine Inn or any other businesses in that area that can substantiate this claim. I know it's been said that both Kelley and Eddie had met a lot of new people during their few days in Live Oak, so I could see Kelley maybe taking a ride from someone she now knew, but for all we know, she could have just taken a ride from some complete stranger, given the facts that she had been drinking that night and was also pretty emotional at that point. Eddie has made a claim that he thinks maybe Kelley got into Alfredo's vehicle that night because Kelley already knew him from when Alfredo let them store their chickens on his property. And then Eddie speculated that Alfredo took Kelley back to his property and did something with her there. But according to law enforcement, there is nothing to suggest this may have happened, and Alfredo is actually not even considered a person of interest in this case. So in the end, again, I do find this theory to be very plausible given some of the circumstances, but much like the last theory, unfortunately there's no eyewitnesses or surveillance that can prove if any of this may have ever happened. Now this next theory is that the guy JR that was staying in the room next to Eddie and Kelley in room 69 may have somehow been involved in Kelley's disappearance. JR's full name is John Robert Bonnell, if I'm saying that correctly, who is a convicted felon with a history of violence. And I believe he's currently incarcerated right now on drug charges and also for a charge of felon in possession of a weapon. So according to Eddie, the night that Kelley went missing, JR was trying to get Kelley to come hang out with him in his hotel room, to which she declined. From what I understand, JR is one of the persons of interest from the motel that night, and also one of the people that Kelley was hanging around and drinking with as well. Well, on July 16th, the day after Kelley went missing, Eddie was able to locate JR again, and since JR was a Live Oak local, Eddie asked him if there would be any areas in Live Oak that someone could go missing. So JR mentioned a place called Heritage Park. So Eddie drove the two of them over there to check to see if Kelley ended up there somehow, and while walking down the trail in this park, JR ends up meeting up with another man, which turned out to be that JR just used Eddie for a ride to this park to make a drug deal. Now, when JR is later questioned by law enforcement, JR tells them that while they were on their way to Heritage Park, Eddie told him about this dream he had had, which was that Kelley got into someone's car and then someone hurt her. Well, right away, this was really sketchy to me because Kelley had said in that last voicemail to Eddie that she was getting to a car before she said goodbye. And this dream Eddie supposedly said he had lines up with one of the most plausible theories in this case. So in my opinion, I just think it's pretty strange if Eddie did say this to JR, but what if JR was lying about Eddie saying this, and now he's hinted that Kelley did get into someone's car that night and left the sunshine in? Either way, I just think it's kind of suspicious that either one of them would bring this dream up. I wish I could find some confirmation from Eddie if he did in fact talk about this dream to JR. Otherwise, I think it could be some pretty incriminating stuff towards JR, given the fact that no one else seems to really know how Kelley left the sunshine in that night. I do think it's possible that Eddie had already told JR about the voicemail she had left him from that night, but again, without some kind of confirmation from Eddie about all of this, for now I do find it to be a little bit interesting. Also, JR told Eddie that after he knocked on Eddie's door that night to come get Kelley because she was crying, that he then just went back to his room and went to sleep, which was around 10:30 p.m. Well, a woman named Amber who was at the motel that night has told law enforcement that they saw JR roaming around the property much later than 10:30 p.m. that night. So if this is true, then in my opinion, it just adds to the other suspicions I already have towards JR. One other thing. At some point, Eddie checked out of the Sunshine Inn again, and after he did, he then asked JR if he could store some of his music equipment in JR's room while Eddie went out and looked for Kelley again. Well, when Eddie returned from looking for Kelley, his stuff was gone, and it turned out that JR gave his stuff to another person of interest in this case, Chuck, and Chuck went down to the pawn shop and sold Eddie's equipment. Eddie was able to retain his items, but when asked by law enforcement if he wanted to press charges on these two guys, Eddie replied no. It just doesn't make sense to me as to why Eddie didn't follow through with pressing charges on JR and Chuck, especially since the night Kelley went missing, Eddie says JR was making passes at her and trying to get her to come inside his room, and now JR has stolen his equipment and Chuck pawned it all. Now, I know this part of the theory doesn't point in the direction of why Kelley went missing, but I think it just shows us how untrustworthy JR and his buddy Chuck truly are. And being that they are considered persons of interest in this case, and JR's criminal history, it really makes me start to speculate that at least one of them knows what may have happened to Kelley that night. And on that note, I'd like to go ahead and get into my final theory that I want to talk about for this case, and this theory surrounds Eddie. Now, when it comes to Eddie, it has been said that he has been very cooperative with law enforcement. But at the end of the day, he's still considered a person of interest in this case. There are plenty of reasons why he's considered a person of interest, and a big one is that we now know about the numerous domestic disputes Kelley and him have had in the past. But for this last theory, I'm just going to focus on one. So there are people out there that do speculate Eddie may have possibly tampered with Kelley's phone by basically skewing the actual timeline in some of the events in this case. According to the two Sleuths podcast who were able to obtain Eddie's phone records, it appears that between 9 to 15 text messages had been deleted. There's also a clear change in Kelley's texts as far as misspellings, grammar, and slang words that start to become more pronounced at a certain point throughout the night. This comes after an alleged estimated 1-hour lapse without any communication from Kelley's phone. Perhaps this happened after she was socializing and sharing wine with some of those other people in the parking lot of the motel, or the allegation has been made that maybe someone else was texting from Kelley's phone. This is pure speculation at this point, but the change in the typed text was noticed by police and a college linguistics class that analyzed the text thread. Now, one of Kelley's friends, who was an audio engineer, was able to put the audio from Kelley's last voicemail into Isotope RX. And Isotope RX is a powerful audio restoration and editing software suite, primarily used for fixing, enhancing, and polishing audio recordings. It offers a visual interface similar to a photo editor, allowing users to identify and remove unwanted sounds like clicks, hums, and background noise. RX is popular in music production, post-production, and content creation for its ability to rescue flawed audio and refine recordings. Now, without having to get too deep into this, because there's a lot here, I'm just going to try and give you the gist of what this audio engineer concluded about the last voicemail. And if you want to read the whole rundown, you can read it on the Part 2 Kelley Brannon episode from the Two Sleuths podcast. He basically believes that the voicemail audio indicates two different audio sources, which can be seen when either a splice or a digital change is made in the audio. He also thinks it could be possible that the voicemail was tampered with, maybe even edited, and then re-recorded. Now again, it's a pretty long explanation to how he concluded this, but one thing that is also interesting about this theory is that Kelley's friends have said that Eddie was a musician who knew how to record and edit audio for his songs on a computer. And from what I've gathered from this case is that with the devices Eddie possessed at the time, he may have been able to pull this off. Now, that's not to say that Eddie even knew how to alter someone's voicemail audio, but if he was able to do so, then he would be able to maintain his theory that Kelley really got into a car that night, leading to Kelley's unexplained disappearance, and a trail of evidence that police are just unable to find. I do have to agree with Katie Kaplan here that this information is quite compelling. But however, if Eddie did do something to harm Kelley and then disposed of her body, then how do we explain him doing so? I feel that if there was any suspicious movement coming from Eddie at that motel, then someone would have noticed this on the motel surveillance. But to be fair, room 70 that Eddie and Kelley had rented and other areas of the motel were not inside of this surveillance angle. So I guess it is possible Eddie could have done all of this and just got lucky that none of this was captured on camera or that anyone saw him. But I just feel that this is a type of theory that needs to be further looked into by a forensic specialist. But until that happens, I do have to say that this audio tampering theory isn't impossible, but it also doesn't seem to be very plausible at this point in time either. So in conclusion to all of these theories, I do speculate that Kelley getting into someone's car that night that she was most likely familiar with seems to be the most plausible explanation here. And then once she was driven off of the property, then something very bad happened to her. Now whether that be with JR and some of his buddies that were present at the motel that night, or if it was with someone else she had met during their time in Live Oak, I just think this theory makes the most sense right now given the facts of this case that are out there right now. I do speculate that the rest of the theories, minus the one where she just took off on her own, all could be possible, but I also don't find them to be very plausible either. Being that Kelley's case is still considered an open case, I do speculate that law enforcement probably has more information about this case that they're just not ready to divulge to the public. And until they do so, one can really only speculate as to what may have happened to Kelley Brannon in those fateful, very early morning hours of July 15th, 2020 in Live Oak, Florida. Now, before I go ahead and end this episode, I just wanted to point out a few things real quick that I wasn't able to get to during the course of the episode. One thing is that in the Never Seen Again episodes that covered this case, Eddie does say that he took a polygraph pertaining to Kelley's disappearance, but unfortunately that is not true. I'm not even quite sure why he would say this, but according to law enforcement, they have confirmed that they never administered a polygraph exam to Eddie Emerson. The other thing I wanted to say is that on the Missing Kelley Brannon Facebook group, a person who said they were a local to Live Oak was quoted saying, "Human trafficking, it's alive and well out here." And I think this could bring credence as to the reason why Kelley went missing that night, because it is something that unfortunately is more common than we like to believe, and it does occur far too often. So that's why everyone always needs to be aware of their surroundings wherever they may go, and also always be aware of the type of people you choose to associate or hang out with as well. One last thing that I have about this case There has been a lot of reporting that a Mexican restaurant called Armando's that was down the street from the Sunshine Inn may have had some people from there that could have information about Kelley's disappearance. And even though it's been said it was a sketchy place at times, law enforcement did look into the restaurant, and from what I understand now, there isn't any connection from Armando's to Kelley's case. Now, to go ahead and wrap up here, I just wanted to start by thanking everyone who made it to the end of this episode. Also, a big thank you to Katie Kaplan for all of the great investigative work you have put into this case. And another big thank you to all of Kelley's friends who are out there continuing to advocate for Kelley as well. When Kelley Brannon disappeared from the Sunshine Inn in Live Oak, Florida on July 15, 2020, she was 36 years old. And if alive somewhere out there today, she would be 41. Kelley was about 5'5" and weighed about 130 pounds. She had brown eyes and black hair with gray streaks in it, and she also had an anarchy tattoo on her right hand that consisted of the letter A with a circle around it. Also, be on the lookout for Kelley's rare left-handed Stratocaster guitar with the branding stripped off, because like I said before, finding this guitar could help unlock some clues in Kelley's disappearance. So if you or anyone you know has any information related to Kelley Brannon's disappearance, please do not hesitate to call the Live Oak Police Department at 386-362-2222 or call the Swanee Crime Stoppers at 386-208-8477, to which you can remain anonymous. It seems that there are a lot of people out there that would love to see Kelley come home one day, or at the very least find out what happened to her. Unfortunately, her mother passed away a couple years ago and won't get that chance one day. But she has plenty of great friends out there that still care about her, and I hope that one day they're all able to find some closure in all of this. So thank you again everyone for tuning in to another episode of Drue Crime. I'm your host Drue V, and my always friendly reminder to all of you, love everyone, but trust no one, and I will definitely see you here again in a couple weeks, but until then, take care and stay safe out there.